There is a specific weight to it, not the metaphorical weight of reputation, not the philosophical weight of legacy. The actual, physical, undeniable weight of a Harman Kardon Citation II amplifier sitting cold and still on a shelf in 1960. Try to pick it up. The chassis is cold-rolled steel. The transformer inside, that heavy copper-wound iron core at the absolute heart of the machine, weighs more than most modern laptops. When you set it down, it lands with a soft, deliberate thud, like a judge placing a gavel, like a statement being made. The front panel is understated to the point of arrogance. No flashing LEDs, no glowing power meters dancing to the music, no brushed aluminum fins competing for your attention. Just a series of cleanly machined knobs, a few toggle switches, and a face that catches the light in a particular, unrepeatable way. The kind of industrial design that communicates quality not by shouting, but by refusing to perform. You power it on. The vacuum tubes behind the panel begin to glow. Amber first, then deeper, then a warm and ancient gold. The room fills with the faint smell of heated metal and warm glass, and the sound that eventually emerges from the speakers wired to its output terminals is not loud. It doesn't need to be. It is, instead, dense, present, alive. That amplifier was built by two men who believed, genuinely, almost recklessly believed, that high-fidelity sound was not a luxury reserved for collectors and engineers. They believed it was a democratic right, a birthright of the serious music listener. Their names were Sidney Harman and Bernard Kardon, and the company they built together in a rented New York workspace in 1953 would eventually grow into the largest audio conglomerate in the history of recorded sound. At its absolute peak, Harman International owned JBL. It owned Infinity. It owned AKG. It owned Lexicon, DBX, Mark Levinson, Revel, Studer, and Crown. Its electronics were embedded in the dashboards of Mercedes-Benz sedans, BMW motorcycles, and Toyota luxury vehicles. It sold products in 157 countries. On November 14, 2016, Samsung Electronics announced the acquisition of Harman International Industries for approximately $8 billion. It was the largest acquisition in Samsung's corporate history. The audio empire was over, but the story of how it got there, the genius, the hubris, the tragedy, and the beautiful, irreplaceable sound that built it all, is worth understanding in full. The year is 1953. America is humming. Not with music, with possibility. The Korean War has just ended. The suburban dream is being poured in concrete and planted with young trees across Long Island and New Jersey. And in the living rooms of these new homes, something extraordinary is happening. Americans are falling in love with sound. Not the tinny, compressed sound of a kitchen radio. Real sound. High-fidelity sound. The kind of reproduction so accurate, so present, so three-dimensional, that it could convincingly recreate the experience of sitting inside a concert hall without ever leaving the house. High-fidelity. Hi-fi, as the magazines had started calling it, was the defining consumer technology of the American 1950s, and at the center of it, working against the tide of mediocrity that dominated the retail market, stood two men who refused to compromise. Bernard Kardon was the engineer. Born in New York, trained in electrical engineering, Kardon possessed an almost pathological obsession with the physics of sound reproduction. He had spent the better part of the late 1940s studying the behavior of FM radio transmissions, not as a hobbyist, but as a scientist who had identified a fundamental gap between what FM signals were capable of delivering and what commercially available receivers were actually built to decode. The problem, Kardon understood with cold precision, was not the signal. The signal was extraordinary. The problem was the machinery receiving it. American radio manufacturers were building FM tuners as afterthoughts, bolting mediocre high-frequency circuits onto products primarily designed to sell AM reception. The sensitive, revealing nature of FM was being strangled inside cheap chassis. Sidney Harman was the businessman. Younger than Kardon, more aggressive, possessing the kind of confident intellectual energy that made him equally comfortable debating circuit topology and negotiating distribution contracts. Harman had been working in the audio distribution trade, and he had watched with mounting frustration as American consumers were sold mediocre equipment at premium prices by brands that understood marketing far better than they understood acoustics. Together, they rented space, they built circuits, they argued, constantly, brilliantly, productively. Two men who agreed on the destination, but fought about every step of the road. And in 1953, they released a product that changed the landscape entirely. The Harman Kardon Festival. TA230 was, in the dry language of technical specifications, an integrated tuner amplifier. In the language of music, it was a revelation. Prior to the festival, a serious hi-fi listener needed to purchase a separate AM tuner, a separate FM tuner, a separate preamplifier, and a separate power amplifier. 4 distinct boxes, 4 separate power cables, a complex web of interconnecting signal cables, and a significant total financial commitment. The high-fidelity market, by design or accident, had made itself exclusionary. It was the hobby of engineers, academics, and the genuinely wealthy. The festival TA230 collapsed this entire ecosystem into a single chassis. It contained an AM tuner, an FM tuner with genuinely sensitive circuitry, a full preamplifier stage, and a power amplifier capable of driving a real pair of speakers with authority. The design was elegant, the build quality was exceptional, and the price, while not inexpensive, was genuinely accessible to a determined middle-class music listener who was willing to prioritize sound over furniture. But what distinguished the festival from every competitor on the market was not its integrated configuration. It was Kardon's obsessive, almost furious attention to FM tuner sensitivity and selectivity. FM radio, at this point in American broadcasting history, was dramatically underutilized. Most manufacturers treated FM as a secondary feature, a selling point that looked impressive in a catalog, but was implemented with minimal engineering care. The FM sections of most integrated receivers were electrically noisy, prone to interference from adjacent stations, and required a listener to live within close geographic range of a transmitter to achieve a clean, stable signal. Kardon had studied FM front-end circuit design at a depth that very few audio engineers had bothered to explore. He designed a tuner section with a sensitivity and selectivity that allowed the festival to pull clean, clear broadcasts from distances and signal strengths that defeated every competitor in the category. When an audiophile in a New York suburb connected the festival to a proper external antenna, the FM tuner became something close to a portal. Orchestral broadcasts from Manhattan stations arrived in their living room with a clarity that seemed, in 1953, almost supernatural. The audio press responded with stunned, unambiguous reviews. The festival was, according to multiple period publications, the finest domestically available integrated receiver that money could buy. Harman Kardon had arrived, and it had arrived on its own terms. Bernard Kardon left the company in 1956. The precise circumstances of his departure have never been fully documented in public records. There were reports of philosophical friction, the inevitable tension between a man who measured success in distortion figures and a man who measured it in market share. Kardon reportedly believed that Harman was steering the company toward volume and commercial expansion at the expense of engineering purity. He had not built those FM circuits to decorate a growing product line. He had built them to solve a problem. Once the problem was solved, the corporate impulse to move on to the next category felt, to him, like a betrayal. Whatever the truth of those final conversations, the engineer who had defined the company's founding philosophy stepped quietly away from the name he had co-created. He pursued other ventures. He never returned. His name, however, remained. It remained on every product the company would ever produce. It remained on the sides of cars and in the dashboards of aircraft. It remained, long after his departure, as a testament to the fact that the original promise, engineering first, marketing second, had once been considered worth honoring. Sidney Harman continued alone, and he was not, by any measure, a lesser force without his co-founder. If anything, Kardon's departure seemed to liberate something in Harman, a restless ambition, a willingness to expand, to acquire, to construct something that transcended any single product category. Harman had always understood the audio market not as a series of isolated niches, but as an integrated ecosystem. He wanted to own the ecosystem. And the first extraordinary object that emerged from this solo chapter was the product that would define the brand's golden age. The citation amplifiers are, to this day, objects of reverence among serious audio collectors. They were not designed for casual listening. They were not designed for the suburban living room filled with the noise and movement of ordinary domestic life. They were designed for the person who sat down, deliberately, in the quiet, to listen. Nothing else. Just listen. The Citation 1 was a preamplifier. The Citation 2 was a stereo power amplifier, built around a push-pull KT88 output tube configuration that produced a conservatively rated 60 watts per channel, in an era when this represented more clean, controlled power than most professional amplification equipment could reliably provide. The Citation 3 was an FM tuner of extraordinary sensitivity. Together, they formed a complete high-fidelity system whose sophistication and musical accuracy had no precedent in the American market. The build quality was a physical argument in favor of the product's asking price. Each Citation 2 chassis was wired by hand. Component selection was obsessive, resistors chosen and matched for tolerances, capacitors specified for long-term electrical stability, output transformers wound to specifications that the engineering team refused to disclose to competitors. The result was an amplifier that measured extraordinarily well on laboratory instruments. But more importantly, and this distinction matters enormously in audio, where measurements are necessary but never sufficient, it sounded extraordinary. There is a real distinction between an amplifier that measures well and an amplifier that sounds musical. A clean frequency response graph is a static electrical portrait of a machine at rest. It does not capture dynamic behavior. It does not reveal micro-detail retrieval, the quality of the noise floor, the subtle and complex way the output stage interacts with a real speaker's reactive impedance. These qualities reveal themselves only through extended listening, only through hours spent with real music and real speakers in real rooms. They were qualities that the Citation series possessed in abundance. The audiophile press of the late 1950s and 1960s was constitutionally incapable of easy enthusiasm. These were publications staffed by engineers, academics, and professional music lovers who had built their own amplifiers from scratch and were equipped to detect the slightest deviation between what a product promised and what it delivered. They measured everything. They listened with trained, practiced ears. They loved the Citation series unconditionally. High Fidelity Magazine, Audio Magazine, the British publication Hi-Fi News. Each responded to the Citation products with reviews that mixed precise objective measurement data with the kind of enthusiastic prose normally reserved for live concert performances. The Citation 2 was not, to these writers, simply a well-made amplifier. It was described as an event, an experience, a reference against which other amplifiers were subsequently measured and found wanting. This was the first golden age of Harman Kardon, and it established something that would define the brand for the next 4 decades. even as the brand itself changed beyond recognition. The idea that a Harman Kardon product was distinguished not by what it showed you on a specification sheet, but by what it made you feel when the music played. That distinction between the measurable and the musical was the company's founding gift to the audio world, and it was, ultimately, the first thing the audio world would watch the company abandon. The year is 1969. The man who built JBL is 20 years dead. James Bullough Lansing, whose initials the company carried as its permanent monument, had taken his own life in 1949, overwhelmed by debt and the impossible weight of maintaining creative genius alongside business survival simultaneously. The company he left behind had, in the 2 decades since, become something extraordinary under the stewardship of William Thomas and a brilliant engineering team that honored Lansing's obsessions with transducer design while building a commercially viable organization around them. JBL speakers were the standard reference monitors in every serious recording studio in Los Angeles. They were in Capitol Records, in Columbia's West Coast facility, in the room where Frank Sinatra placed his microphone, and the room where Phil Spector constructed his wall of sound. They were the speakers installed in the legendary Muscle Shoals Sound Studio in Alabama, where the rhythm section that defined an era of Southern soul music worked through their parts. The sound of American popular music, across an entire generation, passed through JBL transducers on its way to tape. When Sidney Harman acquired JBL in 1969, the audio world took notice. This was not a casual business transaction. This was a declaration of philosophy. Harman was building something that had no precedent in the American audio industry. He was constructing a portfolio, a family of complementary brands, each occupying a specific and defensible market position, each representing genuine engineering excellence in its category, all operating under the shelter of a single corporate umbrella. It was, if the vision held, an audio ecosystem that would be uniquely resilient to competitive pressure, a company where each brand reinforced every other. JBL gave Harman's parent company something that amplifiers alone could never provide: a direct, physical, acoustic connection to the professional music world. When a recording engineer spent 8 hours a day listening to JBL monitors in a studio, the brand was woven permanently into the fabric of their professional identity. When that same engineer went home and wanted speakers for their own listening room, the psychological path of least resistance led them directly back to those same initials. But the JBL acquisition was also the beginning of something else, something harder to name at the time. The first, faint suggestion of a fundamental tension that would never fully resolve itself in the decades to come. A company built on 2 men and a shared obsession is one kind of entity. A company that acquires other companies, that manages multiple brands, that must allocate engineering resources and marketing budgets across multiple product categories, is an entirely different kind of entity. The decisions start to be made in spreadsheets rather than listening rooms. The criteria for success migrate from the quality of a piano's upper harmonics through a new speaker system toward quarterly revenue targets and market share projections. Sidney Harman understood this tension intellectually. He understood it in his bones. The question that would haunt Harman International for the entirety of its corporate life, was whether understanding the tension was the same as resolving it. In 1977, President Jimmy Carter appointed Sidney Harman as the United States Deputy Secretary of Commerce. To understand what this appointment meant for the company, you must understand what Sidney Harman meant to the company. He was not, by this point in the organization's life, simply a CEO executing a pre-existing strategy. He was the company's animating intelligence, its conscience, its living institutional memory. Every significant product decision, every meaningful acquisition, every difficult negotiation with a major distribution partner was filtered through his personal judgment. His presence was not a layer of corporate management. It was the company's nervous system. When he entered government service, he did not step away from a well-functioning machine. He removed the central gear from a complex, interlocking mechanism. What followed, over the subsequent 2 years, was a series of management decisions that a less diplomatic observer might describe as catastrophic. In Harman's absence, the company's leadership made expansion choices that prioritized visible growth over sustainable profitability. Product inventories expanded beyond rational capacity. Product lines were diluted with entries that carried the Harman brand without carrying the Harman standard. The manufacturing discipline that had defined the citation era began to quietly erode. By 1979, when Harman returned from Washington, the company he had spent 25 years building was in genuine financial distress. The stock had collapsed. The product reputation was fraying at every edge. The organization was in a state of internal conflict between factions that had developed in the vacuum of his absence. What he did next was, by any measure of business history, extraordinary. He bought the company back. Using his own personal capital, accumulated over decades, he mounted a leveraged buyout of the public company he had originally founded. The transaction was complicated, contested, and deeply personal. It was also successful. Harman repurchased control of his own legacy and spent the next several years painstakingly rebuilding what the absence had damaged: the product standards, the engineering culture, and the brand reputation that had taken him 2 decades to construct. The company that emerged from this reconstruction was leaner, more focused, possessed of a renewed and hard-won awareness of its own vulnerability. Sidney Harman had learned, at extraordinary personal cost, a lesson that would define the next chapter of his company's story: that a company's soul cannot be delegated. The 1980s and 1990s were the era of the grand design. After the near-death experience of the political years, Harman International emerged with a clarity of strategic purpose and a controlled hunger to build the portfolio that Sidney Harman had always envisioned. The acquisitions that followed were not acts of random opportunism. They were deliberate acts of ecosystem construction, each brand chosen for its specific contribution to a coherent whole. In 1983, Infinity Systems was acquired. Infinity had been founded in 1968 by Kerry Christie and Arnold Nudell with a single, almost defiantly ambitious purpose: to build the finest loudspeakers on Earth, regardless of cost or engineering convention. Nudell was a physicist who brought a plasma tweeter, a high-frequency driver that used an ionized helium plasma rather than a conventional diaphragm, to his early flagship designs. The resulting sound was unlike anything else in the market, extended to the highest audible frequencies, airy, eerily accurate, physically unnerving in its precision. Infinity's IRSV loudspeaker system, a floor-to-ceiling array of drivers that cost more than most family automobiles, was the global reference standard for audiophile speaker design throughout the decade. In 1994, AKG Acoustics of Vienna was acquired. AKG was an Austrian company founded in 1947 with a particular expertise in microphones and professional headphones that had made it the technical reference standard in European recording studios. The AKG C414 microphone, developed over multiple generations of evolutionary refinement, was the most universally trusted condenser microphone in professional recording. It was the instrument of choice in Abbey Road, in AIR studios, in the recording rooms of the Vienna Philharmonic. The AKG headphones worn by engineers at these institutions were products of a Viennese engineering culture that had been accumulating acoustic measurement expertise for nearly 5 decades. Lexicon followed, the Massachusetts company that had pioneered digital reverberation and surround sound processing, whose hardware had defined the sonic texture of a generation of major motion picture sound design. Crown International, manufacturer of the professional power amplifiers, trusted by every serious touring concert sound company, came next. Mark Levinson's Madrigal Audio Laboratories, the Connecticut manufacturer of the most critically acclaimed, technically sophisticated, and outrageously expensive consumer audio electronics in North America, was absorbed into the growing structure. The empire was, by the mid-1990s, complete. Harman International now owned every significant segment of the audio chain. They owned the microphones that captured the music in the recording studio. They owned the signal processors that shaped its character. They owned the professional amplifiers that powered stadium concert stages. They owned the luxury consumer amplifiers that reproduced those recordings in private listening rooms. They owned 3 of the most respected loudspeaker brands in the world. They had built, through 2 decades of patient acquisition and strategic patience, something that no competitor could easily replicate. And they were placing their name and their engineering into something that would change the company's center of gravity in ways that no one in 1985 could have accurately predicted: the interior of the automobile. The automotive audio partnership that Harman established with Mercedes-Benz in the early 1990s was, in retrospect, the single most consequential business decision in the company's history. Whether its long-term consequence was ultimately constructive or corrosive depends entirely on what you believed Harman International was supposed to be. A luxury automobile is a demanding acoustic environment. The challenges are formidable: road noise, wind noise, multiple listeners seated at varying distances from the speaker array, a complex interior geometry that creates destructive acoustic interference patterns at specific frequencies. Building an audio system that sounds genuinely exceptional in a moving vehicle requires sophisticated digital signal processing, precise speaker placement geometry, and an active calibration process that accounts for the unique acoustic fingerprint of each specific car interior model. Harman's engineering teams, drawing simultaneously on the acoustic expertise of JBL, the digital processing capability of Lexicon, and the parent company's own acoustic research, were uniquely positioned to solve these problems. The result was a branded audio experience, available as a premium factory option in Mercedes-Benz vehicles, that gave wealthy car buyers an immediately tangible demonstration of what serious engineering could accomplish in an impossible listening environment. A driver who paid for the optional Harman Kardon audio system was not purchasing a specification sheet. They were purchasing the experience of sitting inside a concert hall that happened to have a steering wheel. The automotive business scaled with a speed that the consumer audio business could never match. Partnerships followed with BMW, with Toyota, with Chrysler, with Audi, and eventually with most major global vehicle manufacturers. The revenue from automotive audio systems, which carried strong margins, long supply contract horizons, and the kind of predictable recurring income that Wall Street had always wanted from the company, eventually exceeded the revenue from consumer audio products entirely. This was extraordinary financial news for investors, and it was, simultaneously, a transformation so fundamental that it effectively changed the nature of the organization. Harman International was no longer, in any meaningful operational sense, primarily an audio company. It was an automotive technology supplier that happened to own some of the most famous audio brand names in the world. The brands didn't disappear. JBL continued making speakers. Harman Kardon continued making receivers. AKG continued making headphones and microphones. But the center of corporate gravity had migrated. The decisions about which brands received engineering investment, which product lines were developed, which technologies were prioritized, these decisions were increasingly being made in the context of what could be leveraged to secure the next automotive supply contract, not what would push the absolute boundaries of acoustic performance. There is a concept in material science called entropy, the tendency of any complex, highly ordered system to gradually move toward disorder. It does not happen in a single catastrophic event. It happens in 1,000 small decisions, each individually defensible, each reasonable in isolation, collectively devastating in aggregate. The entropy of Harman International's audio brands began in the mid-1990s and accelerated through the following decade. The JBL consumer speaker line, which through the 1980s had offered products that were genuinely competitive with the finest European and Japanese speaker manufacturers, began its migration toward the mass market. The engineering teams that had developed the legendary L100 bookshelf speaker and the 4310 studio monitor, speakers that had defined the sonic character of Los Angeles rock recording, were gradually reallocated toward automotive projects and consumer electronics volume categories. The products that replaced them were not technically incompetent. They were, in many cases, commercially competent. But they were not the products of a company operating at the absolute frontier of acoustic engineering. They were the products of a company optimizing for margin and market penetration. AKG's story was, arguably, the most painful narrative within the larger decline. The Viennese engineering culture that Harman had acquired in 1994 was not simply a collection of microphone designs and headphone patents. It was a living community: acoustic engineers, precision measurement scientists, highly skilled craftspeople who had been accumulating institutional knowledge for nearly 5 decades. Their relationship to precision was not a corporate policy. It was a cultural inheritance, passed from one generation of engineers to the next, across a half-century of uninterrupted operation in a single city. When corporate decisions restructured AKG's engineering operations, when teams were reorganized and manufacturing was relocated for cost efficiency, the institutional knowledge did not transfer automatically with the org chart revisions. It dissipated, quietly, irreversibly. The C414 microphone and its descendants remained in production, and they remained commercially successful products. The brand name remained on the packaging. But the specific combination of human expertise, accumulated acoustic intuition, and engineering culture that had made the original instruments the obsessive first choice of the world's finest recording engineers. That combination began to come apart at the seams, not with a dramatic failure, with a gradual, almost invisible diminishment. The Mark Levinson brand suffered its own particular indignity. The founder himself had long since departed to pursue subsequent ventures, Cello Audio and later Red Rose Music, leaving behind a name that had, under Madrigal's stewardship, maintained an extraordinary level of engineering integrity. But as part of Harman's expanding portfolio, the brand found itself occupying an increasingly uncomfortable position. Nominally positioned as ultra-luxury audio electronics, while the corporate owner was simultaneously telling investors that platform sharing and component standardization across multiple price tiers were the strategic priorities of the future. Platform sharing is a rational corporate strategy. It reduces manufacturing costs, simplifies supply chain complexity, and allows engineering teams to be deployed more efficiently across multiple product categories. It also makes a $20,000 amplifier harder to justify on engineering grounds when its fundamental circuit architecture has visible similarities to components appearing in products costing a fraction of the price. The audiophile community noticed. They always notice. The year 2000 brought a crisis that came close to ending Harman International entirely. KKR, Kohlberg Kravis Roberts, the private equity firm that had defined the leveraged buyout era, entered into advanced negotiations to acquire Harman in a transaction that valued the company at approximately $5 billion. The deal would have taken Harman private and subjected it to the standard private equity operational playbook: aggressive overhead reduction, asset rationalization, financial re-engineering, and a planned exit through resale or public reoffering within 5 to 7 years. The audio brands that Sidney Harman had spent 40 years collecting would, under this scenario, have been evaluated purely as financial assets. Their engineering teams would have been assessed for efficiency. Their product lines would have been reviewed for margin optimization. The accumulated acoustic expertise embedded in those organizations would have been given precisely the weight that a discounted cash flow model assigns to intangible human capital. None. The deal collapsed. The reasons were structurally complex, a combination of market conditions, due diligence concerns about the long-term viability of the automotive supply contracts, and what insiders described as a fundamental incompatibility between KKR's financial engineering vision and the operational reality of a company whose core value was largely embedded in engineering capability and brand reputation rather than in hard, collateralizable assets. But the near acquisition left marks that did not fade. The episode exposed, with brutal clarity, that Harman International had evolved into exactly the kind of company that private equity finds attractive: large enough to matter, complex enough to contain inefficiencies, possessing enough brand equity to establish a floor for asset value. The transformation from an audio company into a diversified industrial concern had proceeded so far that the name Harman Kardon on the corporate door had become, in a very real commercial sense, a financial instrument as much as an engineering identity. Sidney Harman intervened personally. He restructured the balance sheet. He renegotiated key contracts. He guided the company back to operational stability. But he was older now. The fierce, concentrated energy of the man who had rebuilt everything from catastrophe in the early 1980s was not diminished, precisely, but it was operating against a corporate organism of entirely different scale, complexity, and internal momentum. The brands remained intact. The engineers still arrived at work each morning. The products still shipped. But something essential, the animating conviction that acoustic performance was a first principle rather than a competitive differentiator to be optimized against cost, had become progressively harder to locate inside the organization with each passing year. The decade between 2005 and 2015 completed, in a sense, what the automotive pivot had begun 15 years earlier. Harman International's executive leadership made a strategic wager that proved, in the short term, spectacularly correct. The connected car, the automobile equipped with embedded computing systems for navigation, entertainment, communication, and increasingly sophisticated driver assistance, required precisely the kind of systems integration expertise that Harman had assembled for automotive audio. The company expanded aggressively into infotainment system architecture, cybersecurity for connected vehicle platforms, and the cloud software infrastructure required to manage over-the-air software updates for embedded automotive systems. By 2015, the majority of Harman International's revenue, and virtually all of its meaningful growth, was derived from connected car technology and services contracts. The consumer and professional audio brands, JBL, AKG, Harman Kardon, Infinity, Mark Levinson, Lexicon, were operating, from an organizational perspective, as marketing assets within a technology company rather than as engineering enterprises within an audio company. The distinction sounds subtle. Its consequences were anything but. The JBL brand underwent, during this period, a transformation that was commercially extraordinary and philosophically devastating in equal measure. The introduction of the JBL Flip, Charge, and Extreme portable Bluetooth speaker series in the early 2000s created a mass-market consumer electronics category that sold tens of millions of units annually across every continent. The JBL name, the name on the studio monitors at Capitol Records, the name that carried the legacy of James Bullough Lansing and the engineering teams that had defined the sonic character of Golden Age Hollywood recording, became, to an entire generation of consumers, synonymous with a colorful, waterproof cylinder that you carry to the beach or the park. Something you connect to your phone in 12 seconds. Something that falls off a table and survives. The sales figures were genuinely extraordinary. The brand awareness metrics among consumers under 40 were metrics that the audio JBL of 1985 could not have dreamed of achieving. A brand that had been functionally unknown to the mass consumer market was now one of the most recognized names in consumer electronics globally. But in the professional audio world, in the listening rooms of engineers, in the conversations conducted among audiophiles, in the communities where music lovers discuss the equipment they use to hear the world at its clearest, the consensus was increasingly, quietly grim. The brand had been sold, not to Samsung, not yet, to something more pervasive and more permanent, to the convenience of the market. The announcement arrived through standard corporate press release channels at 7:31 in the morning, Eastern Time. Samsung Electronics would acquire Harman International Industries for approximately $8 billion in cash. The price represented a premium of approximately 28% over Harman's closing stock price the previous Friday. The acquisition would be structured as a merger agreement, with Harman operating as a standalone subsidiary under its existing management structure. The financial logic was transparent. Samsung needed to accelerate its competitive position in the connected car technology market. The shift toward autonomous and semi-autonomous vehicle architectures required precisely the kind of embedded systems expertise, the established automotive OEM supply relationships, and the software engineering capability that Harman had spent a decade building. The acquisition compressed years of organic development into a single transaction. The audio brands were, in this corporate calculus, an attractive secondary asset, a set of globally recognized consumer electronics names that Samsung could leverage across its broader product ecosystem. Samsung was not acquiring JBL because Samsung's leadership had spent evenings in listening rooms with difficult loudspeakers and good recordings. Samsung was not purchasing AKG because an engineer in Seoul had been moved to tears by the acoustic clarity of a C414 microphone in a Vienna recording session. Samsung was buying a technology company that happened to have audio brands attached to it. The brands were included in the transaction. They were not the purpose of the transaction. The deal closed in March 2017. For a company founded in 1953 by two men in a rented workspace, the end had arrived. The entire accumulated structure, the brands, the engineering capabilities, the institutional knowledge, the 6 decades of listening room decisions and acoustic measurement expertise, was now operating under the strategic direction of the world's largest consumer electronics manufacturer. The changes that followed were, in their own way, more telling than the acquisition announcement itself. AKG's Vienna engineering and manufacturing operations were substantially restructured in the months following the deal closing. The team that had maintained continuous acoustic engineering operation in Austria since 1947, the engineers who had designed the C414, the D112 kick drum microphone, the K240 headphone, was dramatically reduced. Manufacturing and production were moved to lower-cost facilities in Asia. The C414's most recent product successors arrived with specifications that some of the Vienna engineers who had shaped the lineage's earlier generations subsequently questioned publicly. Lexicon, the digital signal processing company that had defined the art of professional reverberation for a generation of major motion picture sound designers, was effectively marginalized as a standalone professional audio brand. Its core technology retained value as a component within automotive system architectures. As an independent professional audio enterprise, its trajectory flattened and then stopped. The Harman Kardon consumer brand continued producing receivers, soundbars, and portable speakers. The products were competently engineered and reasonably priced. They were not the products of a company that placed acoustic performance above all competing considerations. They were the products of a company that balanced acoustic performance against manufacturing cost, competitive retail pricing, and margin requirements, which is a perfectly rational way to operate a consumer electronics division. Just not the way that Bernard Kardon had operated in 1953 when he was arguing about FM tuner circuit topology with a man who believed, with absolute conviction, that the American listener deserved better. Sidney Harman died on April 4, 2011. He was 83 years old. He did not live to see Samsung's announcement. Whether this was a mercy is not a question with a clean answer. The argument for optimism about the legacy is straightforward. The brands are alive. JBL is one of the most commercially successful audio brand names in the world, with recognition among young consumers that it had never previously achieved. Harman Kardon products are in hundreds of millions of automobiles, bringing genuinely good sound to people who would otherwise be listening to whatever the base specification audio system produced. AKG headphones are in use by millions of people who care, meaningfully, about how music sounds. The names have survived. The products reach more human ears than the original founders could have imagined possible. The argument for tragedy is equally straightforward and, for those who understand what was originally built, more compelling. The specific combination of conditions that made those original products extraordinary, the engineering culture, the competitive obsession with acoustic performance as a first principle, the institutional memory embedded in the Vienna workshops and the Los Angeles speaker laboratories, and the decades of accumulated listening room decisions. That combination is irreplaceable, and it is gone. Not damaged, not weakened, gone. You cannot rebuild a half-century of engineering culture from an acquisition document. You cannot purchase the accumulated judgment of a room full of engineers who have spent their careers learning how sound works and what makes it moving. What you can purchase is the name. And the name, separated from its origin, is a different kind of object. There is a specific frequency at which the Citation 2's output transformer begins to saturate. It is a high frequency beyond the practical range of most human hearing, and it represents the absolute physical limit of what that machine was designed to do. Beyond that frequency, the circuit simply cannot follow the signal. The physics will not permit it. Bernard Kardon understood this limit. He designed around it, below it, within the safe, honest boundaries of what the physics would allow. Every product he touched was a negotiation between the ideal and the possible, between what the circuit wanted to do and what the music required. Sidney Harman understood the same limit in business terms. The ideal was a company whose entire organizational purpose was the uncompromising pursuit of perfect sound reproduction. The possible was a company that could survive and grow and influence the listening experience of millions of people in a market that did not always reward perfection over convenience, depth over accessibility, or engineering purity over manufacturing efficiency. They both worked within their limits. They both, in their different ways, pushed against them. What they built together, across 7 decades, across multiple near collapses and extraordinary recoveries, across the living rooms and recording studios and automobile interiors of the 20th century, gave the world some of the finest sound that industrial civilization had ever produced at scale. The Citation 2 amplifier that sits in a collector's listening room today is cold to the touch. Its tubes glow amber when it warms, the same amber they glowed in 1960 in a suburban home in New Jersey or a university apartment in Manhattan, where someone sat down deliberately to listen to something that moved them. The sound that comes from the speakers connected to its output terminals is dense and present and alive. It does not sound like a product. It sounds like someone believed in something. Walk through the consumer electronics section of any major retail store today. Find the JBL display. Pick up a portable Bluetooth speaker. It is light. It is colorful. It will connect to your phone in seconds and play music wherever you take it. By every available commercial metric, it is a successful product. By every available market measure, it represents the health and growth of a brand with global recognition. But hold it in your hand. Think about the weight of that Citation 2. Think about two men in a rented workspace in New York in 1953, arguing about the behavior of electrons in a high-frequency FM circuit at midnight because they believed it mattered, because they believed that the American music listener deserved something better than what was on the shelf. The gap between those two objects, the Bluetooth cylinder and the glowing steel chassis, is not merely a technological gap. It is not merely a market gap. It is a gap in belief, a gap in what the people making the product thought they were actually doing. The empire that owned JBL, Infinity, and AKG was sold to Samsung Electronics for $8 billion in the autumn of 2016. The sound it was built to protect was not included in the transaction.